Welcome to The Explainer. Have you ever stopped to wonder why there are four different versions of the same story right at the heart of Christianity? Well, today, we're going to unpack that mystery, the four Gospels, and see why their differences are, believe it or not, their greatest strength. All right, so let's just dive right into the big question, the one that kind of hangs over this whole topic. I mean, think about it. If it's one story, shouldn't there be just one official version? Why do we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? It can seem a little redundant, right? But what you're about to see is that it's completely by design. I love this way of thinking about it. Each artist isn't just trying to copy the other. Nope. They're using different lighting, different angles, different styles, all to capture something totally unique about their subject. So the result isn't four paintings that contradict each other. Not at all. It's a much richer, more complete vision of that one person. Okay, so to really get these portraits, we first have to understand the artists themselves, the authors. And maybe even more importantly, we need to know who they were painting for. Who is their audience? What gallery, so to speak, were they trying to reach?
Okay, this slide is awesome because it just lays it all out so clearly for us. Check it out. You've got Matthew. He was a tax collector, writing for a Jewish audience, and his portrait is of Jesus the King. Then there's Mark, writing for the Romans, and he shows Jesus as a servant. After that, we have Luke, the doctor, writing for, pretty much everyone, and he paints Jesus as the perfect man. And finally, you get John, who wrote last, and his whole focus is on Jesus as the divine Son of God. See? Each author, each audience, a totally distinct portrait.
So let's zoom in on our first two portraits and see how this actually works in practice. We're going to start with Matthew and Mark. Now, on the surface, these two accounts can look pretty similar, but they are absolutely aimed at completely different worlds. And wow, this slide just illustrates that difference perfectly. Over on the left, you see Matthew is constantly connecting Jesus back to Jewish history and law. But then on the right, Mark is all about action. He's just moving the story forward for that practical Roman mindset that, frankly, wouldn't care as much about all the ancient Jewish prophecies. So for Matthew, his number one goal is to convince his fellow Jews that Jesus is the one. He's the long-awaited Messiah, the promised king they've been reading about for centuries. He's writing to an audience that knows the prophecies inside and out. So his entire account is built to show exactly how Jesus fulfills them, one by one. And this one line, this is basically the key to Matthew's entire gospel. He's saying, look, don't think for a second that this Jesus is something totally new or radical. No, he is the ultimate completion of everything our people have been waiting for. And just look at the evidence he presents. He's quoting the Old Testament over and over, like more than 60 times. He starts his story with a family tree, literally tracing Jesus' lineage all the way back to Abraham and David, the founders of the Jewish nation. You can tell that every single detail was meticulously chosen for that specific audience. Now, Mark is a whole different ballgame. He's writing what a lot of people think is the very first gospel. And his audience, probably Roman Gentiles. These are people who don't have that deep Jewish historical context. What do they care about? Power, action, results. So what does Mark give them? A fast-paced, action-packed story. He gets right to it. So the really crucial thing to get here is Mark's emphasis on what Jesus did. This portrait he's painting isn't of some king sitting around waiting to be served. It's a portrait of a powerful servant, actively working on behalf of others. For his Roman readers, that idea would have been absolutely revolutionary. And you can totally see how he's catering to this audience. He doesn't assume they know anything about Jewish culture. In fact, he often stops the story to explain local customs or translate Aramaic words. The language Jesus and his disciples would have been speaking. It gives his whole account this very direct, here's what happened feel, almost like it's coming straight from the eyewitness testimony of the Apostle Peter. All right, let's move on to our next two artists, Luke and John. And these guys, they take an even broader, more universal approach with their portraits. So, Luke was a doctor, a top-notch historian, and get this, the only non-Jewish writer in the entire New Testament. So as you can imagine, his perspective is totally unique. He's presenting Jesus not just for the Jews or just for the Romans, but as the perfect man for all of humanity. His gospel is just packed with stories you won't find anywhere else. Stories about the marginalized people in society, the poor, women, the outcasts. And as a physician, it makes sense that he pays special attention to the healings. It all comes together to create this incredibly detailed, compassionate, and just universally accessible portrait. And finally, we come to John. Now, he's writing last, probably sometime between 85 and 90. So he's assuming his readers have probably already heard the stories from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's why he doesn't just retell what happened. He's here to explain what it all means.
Honestly, John's opening is just breathtaking. He goes all the way back, before time itself, to make his central point crystal clear. Jesus wasn't just a great man, or a king, or a servant. He was divine. John's purpose here is completely, explicitly theological. And he builds his case like a lawyer in a courtroom. It's amazing. He presents 7 specific miracles that he calls signs. He records 7 I am statements where Jesus claims a divine title for himself. He even calls 7 different witnesses to the stand, so to speak. It is this powerful, highly structured argument for Jesus' identity. Okay, so we've looked at each of these portraits individually. Now what happens when we hang them all together in the same gallery? Well, what we get isn't confusion, it's clarity. We see this one figure who is, all at the same time, a king who fulfills prophecy, a servant who acts, a perfect man who shows incredible compassion, and a divine son who reveals God. Each gospel adds a vital layer, creating a portrait that's so much richer than any single account ever could on its own. So I think the ultimate takeaway here is that these different perspectives, they're a strength, not a weakness. They show us that a story this big, this significant, just can't be contained by a single viewpoint. And it kind of leaves us with a cool question to ponder, right? If another account were written today for our world, what aspect of this figure would it need to emphasize the most? It's something to think about.